A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. Water Discovered. For a whole hour I was trying to work out in my delirious brain the reasons which might have influenced this seemingly tranquil huntsman. The absurdest notions ran in utter confusion through my mind. I thought madness was coming on. But at last a noise of footsteps was heard in the dark abyss. Hans was approaching. A flickering light was beginning to glimmer on the wall of our darksome prison. Then it came out full at the mouth of the gallery. Hans appeared. He drew close to my uncle, laid his hand upon his shoulder, and gently woke him. My uncle rose up. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Vatten," replied the huntsman. No doubt, under the inspiration of intense pain, everybody becomes endowed with the gift of diverse tongues. I did not know a word of Danish, yet instinctively I understood the word he uttered. "Water! Water!" I cried, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman. "Water!" repeated my uncle. "Hvar?" he asked in Icelandic. "Nidat!" replied Hans. "Where?" "Down below." I understood it all. I seized the hunter's hands and pressed them, while he looked on me without moving a muscle of his countenance. The preparations for our departure were not long in making, and we were soon on our way down a passage inclining 2 feet in 7. In an hour we had gone 1.25 miles and descended 2,000 feet. Then I began to hear distinctly quite a new sound of something running within the thickness of the granite wall, a kind of dull, dead rambling, like distant thunder. During the first part of our walk, not meeting with the promised spring, I felt my agony returning. But then my uncle acquainted me with the cause of the strange noise. "Hans was not mistaken," he said. "What you hear is the rushing of a torrent." "A torrent?" I exclaimed. "There can be no doubt. A subterranean river is flowing around us." We hurried forward in the greatest excitement. I was no longer sensible of my fatigue. This murmuring of waters close at hand was already refreshing me. It was audibly increasing. The torrent, after having for some time flowed over our heads, was now running within the left wall, roaring and rushing. Frequently I touched the wall, hoping to feel some indications of moisture, but there was no hope here. Yet another half hour, another half league was passed. Then it became clear that the hunter had gone no farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to mountaineers, he had as it were felt this torrent through the rock, but he had certainly seen none of the precious liquid. He had drunk nothing himself. Soon it became evident that if we continued our walk we should widen the distance between ourselves and the stream, the noise of which was becoming fainter. We returned. Hans stopped where the torrent seemed closest. I sat near the wall, while the waters were flowing past me at a distance of 2 feet with extreme violence, but there was a thick granite wall between us and the object of our desires. Without reflection, without asking if there were any means of procuring the water, I gave way to a moment of despair. Hans glanced at me with, I thought, a smile of compassion. He rose and took the lamp. I followed him. He moved towards the wall. I looked on. He applied his ear against the dry stone and moved it slowly to and fro, listening intently. I perceived at once that he was examining to find the exact place where the torrent could be heard the loudest. He met with that point on the left side of the tunnel, at 3 feet from the ground. I stirred up with excitement. I hardly dared guess what the hunter was about to do, but I could not but understand, and applaud and cheer him on when I saw him take hold of the pickaxe to make an attack upon the rock. "We are saved!" I cried. "Yes," cried my uncle, almost frantic with excitement. "Hans is right. Capital fellow! Who but he would have thought of it?" Yes, who but he? Such an expedient, however simple, would never have entered our minds. True, it seemed most hazardous to strike a blow of the hammer in this part of the earth's structure. Suppose some displacement should occur and crush us all? Suppose the torrent, bursting through, should drown us in a sudden flood? There was nothing vain in these fancies. But still no fears of falling rocks or rushing floods could stay us now, and our thirst was so intense that, to satisfy it, we would have dared the waves of the North Atlantic. Hans set about the task which my uncle and I together could not have accomplished. If our impatience had armed our hands with power, we should have shattered the rock into 1,000 fragments. Not so Hans. Full of self-possession, he calmly wore his way through the rock with a steady succession of light and skilful strokes, working through an aperture 6 inches wide at the outside. I could hear a louder noise of flowing waters, and I fancied I could feel the delicious fluid refreshing my parched lips. The pick had soon penetrated 2 feet into the granite partition, and our man had worked for above an hour. I was in an agony of impatience. My uncle wanted to employ stronger measures, and I had some difficulty in dissuading him. Still, he had just taken a pickaxe in his hand when a sudden hissing was heard, and a jet of water spurted out with violence against the opposite wall. Hans, almost thrown off his feet by the violence of the shock, uttered a cry of grief and disappointment, of which I soon understood the cause, when, plunging my hands into the spouting torrent, I withdrew them in haste, for the water was scalding hot. "The water is at the boiling point," I cried. "Well, never mind, let it cool," my uncle replied. The tunnel was filling with steam, whilst a stream was forming, which by degrees wandered away into the subterranean windings, and soon we had the satisfaction of swallowing our first draught. Could anything be more delicious than the sensation that our burning intolerable thirst was passing away, and leaving us to enjoy comfort and pleasure? But where was this water from? No matter, it was water, and though still warm, it brought life back to the dying. I kept drinking without stopping, and almost without tasting. At last, after a most delightful time of reviving energy, I cried, "Why, this is a chalybeate spring!" "Nothing could be better for the digestion," said my uncle. "It is highly impregnated with iron. It will be as good for us as going to the spa or to Toplitz." "Well, it is delicious." "Of course it is. Water should be found 6 miles underground. It has an inky flavour which is not at all unpleasant. What a capital source of strength Hans has found for us here. We will call it after his name." "Agreed," I cried. And Hansbach it was from that moment. Hans was none the prouder. After a moderate draught, he went quietly into a corner to rest. "Now," I said, "we must not lose this water." "What is the use of troubling ourselves?" my uncle replied. "I fancy it will never fail." "Never mind, we cannot be sure. Let us fill the water bottle and our flasks, and then stop up the opening." My advice was followed so far as getting in a supply, but the stopping up of the hole was not so easy to accomplish. It was in vain that we took up fragments of granite and stuffed them in. We only scalded our hands without succeeding. The pressure was too great, and our efforts were fruitless. "It is quite plain," said I, "that the higher body of this water is at a considerable elevation. The force of the jet shows that." "No doubt," answered my uncle. "If this column of water is 32,000 feet high, that is, from the surface of the earth, it is equal to the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. But I have got an idea." "Well?" "Why should we trouble ourselves to stop the stream from coming out at all?" "Because—" well, I could not assign a reason. "When our flasks are empty, where shall we fill them again? Can we tell that?" No, there was no certainty. "Well, let us allow the water to run on. It will flow down, and will both guide and refresh us." "That's well planned," I cried. "With this stream for our guide, there is no reason why we should not succeed in our undertaking." "Ha, my boy, you agree with me now!" cried the Professor, laughing. "I agree with you most heartily. Well, let us rest a while, and then we will start again." I was forgetting that it was night. The chronometer soon informed me of the fact, and in a very short time, refreshed and thankful, we all three fell into a sound sleep. End of chapter 23. Recorded in Nottingham, England, on the 16th of January 2006, by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth, by Jules Verne. Chapter 24. Well said, old mole, canst thou work in the ground so fast? By the next day we had forgotten all our sufferings. At first I was wondering that I was no longer thirsty, and I was for asking for the reason. The answer came in the murmuring of the stream at my feet. We breakfasted and drank of this excellent chalybeate water. I felt wonderfully stronger, and quite decided upon pushing on. Why should not so firmly convinced a man as my uncle, furnished with so industrious a guide as Hans, and accompanied by so determined a nephew as myself, go on to final success? Such were the magnificent plans which struggled for mastery within me. If it had been proposed to me to return to the summit of Snaefell, I should have indignantly declined. Most fortunately, all we had to do was descend. "Let us start," I cried, awakening by my shouts the echoes of the vaulted hollows of the earth. On Thursday, at 8 a.m., we started afresh. The granite tunnel, winding from side to side, earned us past unexpected turns, and seemed almost to form a labyrinth, but on the whole its direction seemed to be south-easterly. My uncle never ceased to consult his compass to keep account of the ground gone over. The gallery dipped down a little way from the horizontal, scarcely more than 2 inches in a fathom, and the stream ran gently murmuring at our feet. I compared it to a friendly genius guiding us underground, and caressed with my hand the soft naiad, whose comforting voice accompanied our steps. With my reviving spirits these mythological notions seemed to come unbidden. As for my uncle, he was beginning to storm against the horizontal road. He loved nothing better than a vertical path, but this way seemed indefinitely prolonged. Instead of sliding along the hypotenuse as we were now doing, he would willingly have dropped down the terrestrial radius. But there was no help for it, and as long as we were approaching the centre at all, we felt that we must not complain. From time to time a steeper path appeared. Our naiad then began to tumble before us with a hoarser murmur, and we went down with her to a greater depth. On the whole, that day and the next we made considerable way horizontally, very little vertically. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our calculations, we were 30 leagues southeast of Reykjavik, and at a depth of 2 leagues and a half. At our feet there now opened a frightful abyss. My uncle, however, was not to be daunted, and he clapped his hands at the steepness of the descent. "This will take us a long way," he cried, "and without much difficulty, for the projections in the rock form quite a staircase." The ropes were so fastened by Hans as to guard against accident, and the descent commenced. I can hardly call it perilous, for I was beginning to be familiar with this kind of exercise. This well, or abyss, was a narrow cleft in the mass of the granite, called by geologists a fault, and caused by the unequal cooling of the globe of the earth. If it had at one time been a passage for the eruptive matter thrown out by Snaefell, I still could not understand why no trace was left of its passage. We kept going down a kind of winding staircase, which seemed almost to have been made by the hand of man. Every quarter of an hour we were obliged to halt to take a little necessary repose and restore the action of our limbs. We then sat down upon a fragment of rock, and we talked as we ate and drank from the stream. Of course, down this fault the Hansbach fell into a cascade, and lost some of its volume, but there was enough and to spare to slake our thirst. Besides, when the incline became more gentle, it would of course resume its peaceable course. At this moment it reminded me of my worthy uncle, in his frequent fits of impatience and anger, while below it ran with the calmness of the Icelandic hunter. On the 6th and 7th of July we kept following the spiral curves of this singular well, penetrating in actual distance no more than 2 leagues, but being carried to a depth of 5 leagues below the level of the sea. But on the 8th, about noon, the fault took towards the southeast a much gentler slope, one of about 45 degrees. Then the road became monotonously easy. It could not be otherwise, for there was no landscape to vary the stages of our journey. On Wednesday, the 15th, we were 7 leagues underground, and had travelled 50 leagues away from Snaefell. Although we were tired, our health was perfect, and the medicine chest had not yet had occasion to be opened. My uncle noted every hour the indications of the compass, and the chronometer, the aneroid, and the thermometer the very same which he had published in his scientific report of our journey. It was therefore not difficult to know exactly our whereabouts. When he told me that we had gone 50 leagues horizontally, I could not repress an exclamation of astonishment at the thought that we had now long left Iceland behind. "What is the matter?" he cried. "I was reflecting that if your calculations are correct, then we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "I am not mistaken," I said, and examining the map, I added, "We have passed Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues bring us under the wide expanse of ocean." "Under the sea?" my uncle repeated, rubbing his hands with delight. "Can it be?" I said. "Is the ocean spread above our heads?" "Of course, Axel. What can be more natural? At Newcastle are there not coal mines extending far under the sea?" It was all very well for the Professor to call this so simple, but I could not feel quite easy at the thought that the boundless ocean was rolling over my head. And yet it really mattered very little whether it was the plains and mountains that covered our heads, or the Atlantic waves, so long as we were arched over by solid granite. And besides, I was getting used to this idea, for the tunnel, now running straight, now winding as capriciously in its inclines as in its turnings, but constantly preserving its southeasterly direction and always running deeper, was gradually carrying us to very great depths indeed. 4 days later, Saturday the 18th of July, in the evening, we arrived at a kind of vast grotto, and here my uncle paid Hans his weekly wages, and it was settled that the next day, Sunday, should be a day of rest. End of chapter 24. Read by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk in Nottingham, England. 16th of January 2006. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 25. De Profundis. I therefore awoke next day, relieved from the preoccupation of an immediate start. Although we were in the very deepest of known depths, there was something not unpleasant about it. And besides, we were beginning to get accustomed to this troglodyte life. I no longer thought of sun, moon, and stars, trees, houses, and towns, nor any of those terrestrial superfluities which are necessities of men who live upon the earth's surface. Being fossils, we looked upon all those things as mere jokes. The grotto was an immense apartment. Along its granite floor ran our faithful stream. At this distance from its spring the water was scarcely tepid, and we drank of it with pleasure. After breakfast the Professor gave a few hours to the arrangement of his daily notes. "First," said he, "I will make a calculation to ascertain our exact position. I hope after our return to draw a map of our journey, which will be in reality a vertical section of the globe, containing the track of our expedition." "That will be curious, uncle, but are your observations sufficiently accurate to enable you to do this correctly?" "Yes. I have everywhere observed the angles and the inclines. I am sure there is no error. Let us see now where we are. Take your compass and note the direction." I looked and replied carefully, "southeast by east." "Well," answered the Professor after a rapid calculation, "I infer that we have gone 85 leagues since we started." "Therefore we are under mid-Atlantic?" "To be sure we are." "And perhaps at this very moment there is a storm above, and ships above our heads are being rudely tossed by the tempest?" "Quite probable." "And whales are lashing the roof of our prison with their tails?" "It may be, Axel, but they won't shake us here. But let us go back to our calculation. Here we are 85 leagues southeast of Snaefell, and I reckon that we are a depth of 16 leagues. 16 leagues?" I cried. "No doubt." "Why, this is the very limit assigned by science to the thickness of the crust of the earth." "I don't deny it." "And here, according to the law of increasing temperature, there ought to be a heat of 2732 degrees Fahrenheit." "So there should, my lad." "And all this solid granite ought to be running in fusion." "You see that is not so, and that, as so often happens, facts come to overthrow theories." "I'm obliged to agree. But after all, it is surprising." "What does the thermometer say?" 27 6/10, or 82 degrees Fahrenheit. "Therefore the savants are wrong by 2705 degrees, and the proportional increase is a mistake. Therefore Humphrey Davy was right, and I am not wrong in following him." "What do you say now?" "Nothing." In truth, I had a good deal to say. I gave way in no respect to Davy's theory. I still held to the central heat, although I did not feel its effects. I preferred to admit in truth that this chimney of an extinct volcano, lined with lavas, which are non-conductors of heat, did not suffer the heat to pass through its walls. But without stopping to look up new arguments, I simply took up our situation such as it was. Well, admitting all your calculations to be quite correct, you must allow me to draw one rigid result therefrom. What is it? Speak freely. At the latitude of Iceland, where we are now, the radius of the earth, the distance from the centre to the surface, is about 1,583 leagues. Let us say in round numbers 1,600 leagues, or 4,800 miles. Out of 1,600 leagues, we have gone 12. So you say. And these 12 at a cost of 85 leagues diagonally. Exactly so. In 20 days. Yes. Now 16 leagues are the 100th part of the earth's radius. At this rate we shall be 2,000 days, or nearly 5 years and a half, in getting to the centre. No answer was vouchsafed to this rational conclusion. Without reckoning, too, that if a vertical depth of 16 leagues can be attained only by a diagonal descent of 85, it follows that we must go 8,000 miles in a southeasterly direction. We shall emerge from some point in the earth's circumference, instead of getting to the centre. "Confusion to all your figures and your hypotheses besides!" shouted my uncle in a sudden rage. "What is the basis of them all? How do you know that this passage does not run straight to our destination? Besides, there is a precedent. What one man has done, another man may do." "I hope so, but still, I may be permitted—" "You shall have my leave to hold your tongue, Axel, but not to talk in that irrational way." I could see the awful professor bursting through my uncle's skin, and I took timely warning. "Now look at your aneroid. What does that say?" "It says we are under considerable pressure." "Very good. So you see that by going gradually down and getting accustomed to the density of the atmosphere, we don't suffer at all. Nothing except a little pain in my ears. That's nothing, and you may get rid of even that by quick breathing whenever you feel the pain." "Exactly so," I said, determined not to say a word that might cross my uncle's prejudices. "There is even positive pleasure in living in this dense atmosphere. Have you observed how intense sound is down here?" "No doubt it is. A deaf man would soon learn to hear perfectly." "But won't this density augment?" "Yes, according to a rather obscure law. It is well known that the weight of bodies diminishes as fast as we descend. You know that it is at the surface of the globe that weight is most sensibly felt, and that at the centre there is no weight at all." "I am aware of that, but tell me, will not the air at least acquire the density of water?" "Of course, under a pressure of 710 atmospheres." "And how, lower still?" "Lower down, the density will still increase." "But how shall we go down then?" "Why, we must fill our pockets with stones." "Well, indeed, my worthy uncle, you are never at a loss for an answer." I dared venture no farther into the region of probabilities, for I might presently have stumbled upon an impossibility, which would have brought the professor on the scene when he was not wanted. Still, it was evident that the air, under a pressure which might reach that of thousands of atmospheres, would at last reach the solid state, and then, even if our bodies could resist the strain, we should be stopped, and no reasonings would be able to get us on any further. But I did not advance this argument. My uncle would have met it with his inevitable sac nursem, a precedent which possessed no weight with me. For even if the journey of the learned Icelander were really attested, there was one very simple answer, that in the 16th century there was neither barometer nor aneroid, and therefore Saknussemm could not tell how far he had gone. But I kept this objection to myself, and waited the course of events. The rest of the day was passed in calculations and in conversations. I remained a steadfast adherent of the opinions of Professor Liedenbrock, and I envied the stolid indifference of Hans, who, without going into causes and effects, went on with his eyes shut wherever his destiny guided him. End of chapter 25. Recorded in Nottingham, England, on the 16th of January 2006, by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth, by Jules Verne. Chapter 26. The Worst Peril of All. It must be confessed that hitherto things had not gone on so badly, and that I had small reason to complain. If our difficulties became no worse, we might hope to reach our end, and to what a height of scientific glory we should then attain! I had become quite a Liedenbrock in my reasonings, Seriously, I had. But would this state of things last in the strange place we had come to? Perhaps it might. For several days, steeper inclines, some even frightfully near to the perpendicular, brought us deeper and deeper into the mass of the interior of the earth. Some days we advanced nearer to the centre by 1.5 leagues, or nearly 2 leagues. These were perilous descents, in which the skill and marvellous coolness of Hans were invaluable to us. That unimpassioned Icelander devoted himself with incomprehensible deliberation, and thanks to him we crossed many a dangerous spot which we should never have cleared alone. But his habit of silence gained upon him day by day, and was infecting us. External objects produce decided effects upon the brain. A man shut up between 4 walls soon loses the power to associate words and ideas together. How many prisoners in solitary confinement become idiots, if not mad, for want of exercise for the thinking faculty? During the fortnight following our last conversation, no incident occurred worthy of being recorded. But I have good reason for remembering one very serious event which took place at this time, and of which I could scarcely now forget the smallest details. By the 7th of August, our successive descents had brought us to a depth of 30 leagues. That is, that for a space of 30 leagues there were over our heads solid beds of rock, ocean, continents, and towns. We must have been 200 leagues from Iceland. On that day the tunnel went down a gentle slope. I was ahead of the others. My uncle was carrying one of Ruhmkorff's lamps, and I the other. I was examining the beds of granite. Suddenly, turning round, I observed that I was alone. Well, I thought, I've been going too fast, or Hans and my uncle have stopped on the way. Come, this won't do. I must join them. Fortunately, there is not much of an ascent. I retraced my steps. I walked for a quarter of an hour. I gazed into the darkness. I shouted. No reply. My voice was lost in the midst of the cavernous echoes which alone replied to my call. I began to feel uneasy. A shudder ran through me. Calmly I said to myself, I am sure to find my companions again. There are not 2 roads. I was too far ahead. I will return. For half an hour I climbed up. I listened for a call, and in that dense atmosphere a voice could reach very far. But there was a dreary silence in all that long gallery. I stopped. I could not believe that I was lost. I was only bewildered for a time, not lost. I was sure I should find my way again. Come, I repeated, since there is but one road, and they are on it, I must find them again. I have but to ascend still. Unless indeed missing me, and supposing me to be behind, they too should have gone back. But even in this case, I have only to make the greater haste. I shall find them, I am sure. I repeated those words in the fainter tones of a half-convinced man. Besides, to associate even such simple ideas with words, and reason with them, was a work of time. A doubt then seized upon me. Was I indeed in advance when we became separated? Yes, to be sure I was. Hans was after me, preceding my uncle. He had even stopped for a while to strap his baggage better over his shoulders. I could remember this little incident. It was at that very moment that I must have gone on. Besides, I thought, have I not a guarantee that I shall not lose my way? A clue in the labyrinth that cannot be broken. My faithful stream. I have but to trace it back, and I must come upon them. This conclusion revived my spirits, and I resolved to resume my march without loss of time. How I then blessed my uncle's foresight in preventing the hunter from stopping up the hole in the granite. This beneficent spring, after having satisfied our thirst on the road, would now be my guide among the windings of the terrestrial crust. Before starting afresh, I thought a wash would do me good. I stooped to bathe my face in the Hansbach. To my stupefaction and utter dismay, my feet trod only the rough, dry granite. The stream was no longer at my feet. End of chapter 26. Recorded in Nottingham, England on the 16th of January 2006. By Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk.
Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 27. Lost in the Bowels of the Earth. To describe my despair would be impossible. No words could tell it. I was buried alive, with the prospect before me of dying of hunger and thirst. Mechanically, I swept the ground with my hands. How dry and hard the rock seemed to me. But how had I left the course of the stream? For it was a terrible fact that it no longer ran at my side. Then I understood the reason of that fearful silence, when for the last time I listened to hear if any sound from my companions could reach my ears. At the moment when I left the right road, I had not noticed the absence of the stream. It is evident that at that moment a deviation had presented itself before me, while the Hansbach followed the caprice of another incline, had gone with my companions away into unknown depths. How was I to return? There was not a trace of their footsteps or of my own, for the foot left no mark upon the granite floor. I racked my brain for a solution of this impracticable problem. One word described my position. Lost. Lost at an immeasurable depth. 30 leagues of rock seemed to weigh down upon my shoulders with a dreadful pressure. I felt crushed. I tried to carry back my ideas to things on the surface of the earth. I could scarcely succeed. Hamburg, the house in the Königstrasse, my poor Graubünden, all that busy world underneath which I was wandering about was passing in rapid confusion before my terrified memory. I could revive with vivid reality all the incidents of our voyage, Iceland, M. Fredriksson, Snæfell. I said to myself that if in such a position I was now in, I was fool enough to cling to one glimpse of hope, it would be madness, and the best thing I could do was to despair. What human power could restore me to the light of the sun by rending asunder the huge arches of rock which united over my head, buttressing each other with impregnable strength? Who could place my feet on the right path and bring me back to my company? "Oh, my uncle!" burst from my lips in the tone of despair. It was my only word of reproach, for I knew how much he must be suffering and seeking me wherever he might be. When I saw myself thus far removed from all earthly help, I had recourse to heavenly succor. The remembrance of my childhood, the recollection of my mother, whom I had only known in my tender early years, came back to me, and I knelt in prayer, imploring for the divine help of which I was so little worthy. This return of trust in God's providence allayed the turbulence of my fears, and I was enabled to concentrate upon my situation all the force of my intelligence. I had 3 days' provisions with me, and my flask was full. But I could not remain alone for long. Should I go up or down? Up. Of course, up continually. I must thus arrive at the point where I had left the stream, that fatal turn in the road. With the stream at my feet, I might hope to regain the summit of Snæfell. Why had I not thought of that sooner? Here was evidently a chance of safety. The most pressing duty was to find out again the course of the Hansbach. I rose, and leaning upon my iron-pointed stick, I ascended the gallery. The slope was rather steep. I walked on without hope, but without indecision, like a man who has made up his mind. For half an hour I met with no obstacle. I tried to recognize my way by the form of the tunnel, by the projections of certain rocks, by the disposition of the fractures, but no particular sign appeared, and I soon saw that this gallery could not bring me back to the turning point. It came to an abrupt end. I struck against an impenetrable wall and fell down upon the rock. Unspeakable despair then seized upon me. I lay overwhelmed, aghast. My last hope was shattered against this granite wall. Lost in this labyrinth, whose windings crossed each other in all directions, there was no use to think of flight any longer. Here I must die the most dreadful of deaths. And strange to say, the thought came across me that when some day my petrified remains should be found 30 leagues below the surface in the bowels of the earth, the discovery might lead to grave scientific discussions. I tried to speak aloud, but hoarse sounds alone passed my dry lips. I panted for breath. In the midst of my agony, a new terror laid hold of me. In falling, my lamp had got wrong. I could not set it right, and its light was paling and would soon disappear altogether. I gazed painfully upon the luminous current growing weaker and weaker in the wire coil. A dim procession of moving shadows seemed slowly unfolding down the darkening walls. I scarcely dared to shut my eyes for one moment for fear of losing the least glimmer of this precious light. Every instant it seemed about to vanish, and the dense blackness to come rolling in palpably upon me. One last trembling glimmer shot feebly up. I watched it in trembling and anxiety. I drank it in as if I could preserve it, concentrating upon it the full power of my eyes, as upon the very last sensation of light which they were ever to experience, and the next moment I lay in the heavy gloom of deep, thick, unfathomable darkness. A terrible cry of anguish burst from me. Upon earth, in the midst of the darkest night, light never abdicates its functions altogether. It is still subtle and diffusive, but whatever little there may be, the eye still catches that little. Here there was not an atom. The total darkness made me totally blind. Then I began to lose my head. I arose with my arms stretched out before me, attempting painfully to feel my way. I began to run wildly, hurrying through the inextricable maze, still descending, still running through the substance of the earth's thick crust, a struggling denizen of geological faults, crying, shouting, yelling, soon bruised by contact with a jagged rock, falling and rising again bleeding, trying to drink the blood which covered my face, and even waiting for some rock to shatter my skull against. I shall never know whither my mad career took me. After the lapse of some hours, no doubt exhausted, I fell like a lifeless lump at the foot of the wall and lost all consciousness. End of chapter 27. Krista McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, November 5th, 2005. Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 28. The Rescue in the Whispering Gallery. When I returned to partial life, my face was wet with tears. How long that state of insensibility had lasted I cannot say. I had no means now of taking account of time. Never was solitude equal to this. Never had any living being been so utterly forsaken. After my fall, I had lost a good deal of blood. I felt it flowing over me. Oh, how happy I should have been could I have died, and if death were not yet to be gone through, I would think no longer. I drove away every idea, and, conquered by my grief, I rolled myself to the foot of the opposite wall. Already I was feeling the approach of another faint, and was hoping for complete annihilation, when a loud noise reached me. It was like the distant rumble of continuous thunder, and I could hear its sounding undulations rolling far away into the remote recesses of the abyss. Whence could this noise proceed? It must be from some phenomenon proceeding in the great depths amidst which I lay helpless. Was it an explosion of gas? Was it the fall of some mighty pillar of the globe? I listened still. I wanted to know if the noise would be repeated. A quarter of an hour passed away. Silence reigned in this gallery. I could not even hear the beating of my heart. Suddenly my ear, resting by chance against the wall, caught, or seemed to catch, a certain vague, indescribable, distant, articulate sound, as of words. This is a delusion, I thought. But it was not. Listening more attentively, I heard in reality a murmuring of voices. But my weakness prevented me from understanding what the voices said. Yet it was language, I was sure of it. For a moment I thought the words might be my own, brought back by an echo. Perhaps I had been crying out, unknown to myself. I closed my lips firmly, and laid my ear against the wall again. Yes, truly, someone is speaking. Those are words. Even a few feet from the wall I could hear distinctly. I succeeded in catching uncertain, strange, undistinguishable words. They came as if pronounced in low, murmured voices. The word "forlorad" was several times repeated in a tone of sympathy and sorrow. "Help!" I cried with all my might. "Help!" I listened. I watched in the darkness for an answer, a cry, a mere breath of sound, but nothing came. Some minutes passed. A whole world of ideas had opened in my mind. I thought that my weakened voice could never penetrate to my companions. "Is it they?" I repeated. "What other men can be 30 leagues underground?" Again I began to listen. Passing my ear over the wall from one place to another, I found the point where the voices seemed to be best heard. The word "forlorad" again returned, then the rolling of thunder which had roused me from my lethargy. "No," I said, "no, it's not through such a mass that a voice can be heard. I'm surrounded by granite walls, and the loudest explosion could never be heard here. This noise comes along the gallery. There must be some remarkable exercise of acoustic laws. I listened again, and this time I did distinctly hear my name pronounced across the wide interval. It was my uncle's own voice. He was talking to the guide, and forlorad is a Danish word. Then I understood it all. To make myself heard, I must speak along this wall, which would conduct the sound of my voice just as wire conducts electricity. But there was no time to lose. If my companions moved but a few steps away, the acoustic phenomenon would cease. I therefore approached the wall and pronounced these words as clearly as possible. Uncle Leidenbrock. I waited with the deepest anxiety. Sound does not travel with great velocity. Even increased air density has no effect upon its rate of traveling. It merely augments its intensity. Seconds, which seemed like ages, passed away, and at last these words reached me. Axel! Axel, is it you? Yes, yes, I replied. My boy, where are you? Lost, in the deepest darkness. Where is your lamp? It is out. And the stream? Disappeared. Axel, take courage. Wait, I am exhausted. I can't answer. Speak to me. Courage, resumed my uncle. Don't speak. Listen to me. We have looked for you up the gallery and down the gallery. We could not find you. I wept for you, my poor boy. At last, supposing you were still on the Hansbach, we fired our guns. Our voices are audible to each other, but our hands cannot touch. But don't despair, Axel. It is a great thing that we can hear each other. During this time I had been reflecting. A vague hope was returning to my heart. There was one thing I must know to begin with. I placed my lips close to the wall, saying, My uncle! My boy, came to me after a few seconds. We must know how far we are apart. That is easy. You have your chronometer? Yes. Well, take it. Pronounce my name, noting exactly the second when you speak. I will repeat it as soon as it shall come to me, and you will observe the exact moment when you get my answer. Yes, and half the time between my call and your answer will exactly indicate that which my voice will take in coming to you. Just so, my uncle. Are you ready? Yes. Now attention. I'm going to call your name. I put my ear to the wall, and as soon as the name Axel came, I immediately replied Axel, then waited. 40 seconds, said my uncle. 40 seconds between the two words, so the sound takes 20 seconds in coming. Now, at the rate of 1,120 feet in a second, this is 22,400 feet, or 4 miles and a quarter nearly. 4 miles and a quarter, I murmured. It will soon be over, Axel. Must I go up or down? Down, for this reason. We are in a vast chamber with endless galleries. Yours must lead into it, for it seems as if all the clefts and fractures of the globe radiated around this vast cavern. So get up and begin walking. Walk on, drag yourself along. If necessary, slide down the steep places. And at the end you will find us ready to receive you. Now begin moving. These words cheered me up. Goodbye, Uncle, I cried. I am going. There will be no more voices heard once I have started, so goodbye. Goodbye, Axel. Au revoir. These were the last words I heard. This wonderful underground conversation, carried on with a distance of 4 miles and a quarter between us, concluded with these words of hope. I thanked God from my heart, for it was He who had conducted me through those vast solitudes, to the point where, alone of all others perhaps, the voices of my companions could have reached me. This acoustic effect is easily explained on scientific grounds. It arose from the concave form of the gallery and the conducting power of the rock. There are many examples of this propagation of sounds which remain unheard in the intermediate space. I remember that a similar phenomenon has been observed in many places, amongst others on the internal surface of the gallery of the Dome of St. Paul's in London, and especially in the midst of the curious caverns among the quarries near Syracuse, the most wonderful of which is called Dionysus's Ear. These remembrances came into my mind, and I clearly saw that since my uncle's voice really reached me, there could be no obstacle between us. Following the direction by which the sound came, of course I should arrive in his presence if my strength did not fail me. Therefore I rose, and rather dragged myself than walked. The slope was rapid, and I slid down. Soon the swiftness of the descent increased horribly and threatened to become a fall. I no longer had the strength to stop myself. Suddenly there was no ground under me. I felt myself revolving in the air, striking and rebounding against the craggy projections of a vertical gallery, quite a well. My head struck against a sharp corner of the rock, and I became unconscious. End of chapter 28. Read by Krista McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, November 5th, 2005. A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 29. Thalata, Thalata. When I came to myself, I was stretched in half-darkness, covered with thick coats and blankets. My uncle was watching over me to discover the least sign of life. At my first sigh he took my hand, and when I opened my eyes he uttered a cry of joy. "He lives! He lives!" he cried. "Yes, I'm still alive," I answered feebly. "My dear nephew," said my uncle, pressing me to his breast, "you are saved." I was deeply touched with the tenderness of his manner as he uttered these words, and still more with the care with which he watched over me. But such trials were wanted to bring out the professor's tenderer qualities. At this moment Hans came in. He saw my hand in my uncle's, and I may safely say that there was joy in his countenance. "God dag," he said. "How do you do, Hans? How are you? And now, uncle, tell me where we are at the present moment." "Tomorrow, Axel, tomorrow. Now you are too faint and weak. I have bandaged your head with compresses which must not be disturbed. Sleep now, and tomorrow I will tell you all." "But do tell me what time it is, and what day." "It is Sunday, the 8th of August, and it is 10 at night. You must ask me no more questions until the 10th. In truth, I was very weak, and my eyes involuntarily closed. I wanted a good night's rest, and therefore I went off to sleep, with the knowledge that I had been 4 long days alone in the heart of the earth. Next morning, on awakening, I looked round me. My couch, made up of all our travelling gear, was in a charming grotto adorned with splendid stalactites, and the soil of which was a fine sand. It was half-light. There was no torch, no lamp, yet certain mysterious glimpses of light came from without through a narrow opening in the grotto. I heard, too, a vague and indistinct noise, something like the murmuring of waves breaking upon a shingly shore, and at times I seemed to hear the whistling of wind. I wondered whether I was awake, whether I was dreaming, whether my brain, crazed by my fall, was not affected by imaginary noises, yet neither eyes nor ears could be so utterly deceived. It is a ray of daylight, I thought, sliding in through this cleft in the rock. That is indeed the murmuring of waves. That is the rustling noise of wind. Am I quite mistaken, or have we returned to the surface of the earth? Has my uncle given up the expedition, or is it happily terminated? I was asking myself these unanswerable questions when the professor entered. "Good morning, Axel," he cried cheerily. "I feel sure you are better." "Yes, I am indeed," I said, sitting up on my couch. "You can hardly fail to be better, for you've slept quietly. Hans and I watched you by turns, and we noticed you were evidently recovering." "Indeed, I do feel a great deal better, and I will give you a proof of that presently, if you'll let me have my breakfast." "You shall eat, lad. The fever's left you. Hans rubbed your wounds with some ointment or other of which the Icelanders keep the secret, and they've healed marvellously. Our hunter is a splendid fellow." Whilst he went on talking, my uncle prepared a few provisions, which I devoured eagerly, notwithstanding his advice to the contrary. All the while I was overwhelming him with questions which he answered readily. Then I learnt that my providential fall had brought me exactly to the extremity of an almost perpendicular shaft, and as I had landed in the midst of an accompanying torrent of stones, the least of which would have been enough to crush me, the conclusion was that a loose portion of the rock had come down with me. This frightful conveyance had thus carried me into the arms of my uncle, where I fell, bruised, bleeding, and insensible. Truly it is wonderful that you have not been killed 100 times over, but for the love of God, don't let us ever separate again. We may never see each other more. Not separate? Is the journey not over, then? I opened a pair of astonished eyes, which immediately called for the question, What is the matter, Axel? I have a question to ask you. You say that I am safe and sound. No doubt you are, and all my limbs unbroken. Certainly. And my head? Your head, except for a few bruises, is all right. It is on your shoulders, where it ought to be. Well, I am afraid my brain is affected. Your mind affected? Yes, I fear so. Are we again on the surface of the globe? No, certainly not. Then I must be mad. For don't I see the light of day, and don't I hear the wind blowing, and the sea breaking on the shore? Ah, is that all? Do tell me about it. I can't explain the inexplicable, but you will soon see and understand that geology has not yet learnt all it has to learn. Then let us go, I answered quickly. No, Axel, the open air might be bad for you. Open air? Yes, the wind is rather strong. You must not expose yourself. But I assure you I'm perfectly well. A little patience, my nephew. A relapse might get us into trouble. We have no time to lose, for the voyage may be a long one. The voyage? Yes. Rest today, and tomorrow we will set sail. Set sail? And I almost leaped up. What did it mean? Had we a river, a lake, a sea to depend upon? Was there a ship at our disposal in some underground harbor? My curiosity was highly excited. My uncle vainly tried to restrain me. When he saw that my impatience was doing me harm, he yielded. I dressed in haste. For greater safety, I wrapped myself in a blanket and came out of the grotto. End of chapter 29. Read by Kristen McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, November 5th, 2005.
A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 30. A New Mare Internum. At first I could hardly see anything. My eyes, unaccustomed to the light, quickly closed. When I was able to reopen them, I stood more stupefied even than surprised. "The sea!" I cried. "Yes," my uncle replied. "The Leidenbrock Sea, and I don't suppose any other discoverer will ever dispute my claim to name it after myself as its first discoverer." A vast sheet of water, the commencement of a lake or an ocean, spread far away beyond the range of the eye, reminding me forcibly of that open sea which drew from Xenophon's 10,000 Greeks, after their long retreat, the simultaneous cry, "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" The deeply indented shore was lined with a breadth of fine shining sand, softly lapped by the waves and strewn with the small shells which had been inhabited by the first of created beings. The waves broke on this shore with the hollow echoing murmur peculiar to vast enclosed spaces. A light foam flew over the waves before the breath of a moderate breeze, and some of the spray fell upon my face. On this slightly inclining shore, about 100 fathoms from the limit of the waves, came down the foot of a huge wall of vast cliffs, which rose majestically to an enormous height. Some of these, dividing the beach with their sharp spurs, formed capes and promontories, worn away by the ceaseless action of the surf. Farther on, the eye discerned their massive outline, sharply defined against the hazy distant horizon. It was quite an ocean, with the irregular shores of earth, but desert, and frightfully wild in appearance. If my eyes were able to range afar over this great sea, it was because a peculiar light brought to view every detail of it. It was not the light of the sun, with his dazzling shafts of brightness and the splendor of his rays, nor was it the pale and uncertain shimmer of the moonbeams, the dim reflection of a nobler body of light. No, the illuminating power of this light, its trembling diffusiveness, its bright clear whiteness, and its low temperature, showed that it must be of electric origin. It was like an aurora borealis, a continuous cosmical phenomenon, filling a cavern of sufficient extent to contain an ocean. The vault that spanned the space above, the sky, if it could be called so, seemed composed of vast plains of cloud, shifting and variable vapors, which by their condensation must at certain times fall in torrents of rain. I should have thought that under so powerful a pressure of the atmosphere there could be no evaporation, and yet under a law unknown to me, there were broad tracts of vapor suspended in the air. But then the weather was fine. The play of the electric light produced singular effects upon the upper strata of cloud. Deep shadows reposed upon their lower wreaths, and often between two separated fields of cloud there glided down a ray of unspeakable luster. But it was not solar light, and there was no heat. The general effect was sad, supremely melancholy. Instead of the shining firmament, spangled with its innumerable stars, shining singly or in clusters, I felt that all these subdued and shaded fights were ribbed in by vast walls of granite, which seemed to overpower me with their weight, and that all of this space, great as it was, would not be enough for the march of the humblest of satellites. Then I remembered the theory of an English captain who likened the earth to a vast hollow sphere, in the interior of which the air became luminous because of the vast pressure that weighed upon it, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpine, rolled within upon the circuit of their mysterious orbits. We were, in reality, shut up inside an immeasurable excavation. Its width could not be estimated, since the shore ran widening as far as eye could reach, nor could its length, for the dim horizon bounded the new. As for its height, it must have been several leagues. Where this vault rested upon its granite base, no eye could tell, but there was a cloud hanging far above, the height of which we estimated at 12,000 feet, a greater height than that of any terrestrial vapor, and no doubt due to the great density of the air. The word cavern does not convey any idea of this immense space. Words of human tongue are inadequate to describe the discoveries of him who ventures into the deep abysses of earth. Besides, I could not tell upon what geological theory to account for the existence of such an excavation. Had the cooling of the globe produced it? I knew of celebrated caverns from the descriptions of travelers, but had never heard of any of such dimensions as this. If the grotto of Guajara in Colombia, visited by Humboldt, had not given up the whole of the secret of its depth to the philosopher, who investigated it to the depth of 2,500 feet, it probably did not extend much farther. The immense Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is of gigantic proportions, since its vaulted roof rises 500 feet above the level of an unfathomable lake, and travelers have explored its ramifications to the extent of 40 miles. But what were these cavities compared to that in which I stood with wonder and admiration, with its sky of luminous vapors, its bursts of electric light, and a vast sea filling its bed? My imagination fell powerless before such immensity. I gazed upon these wonders in silence. Words failed me to express my feelings. I felt as if I was in some distant planet, Uranus or Neptune, and in the presence of phenomena of which my terrestrial experience gave me no cognizance. For such novel sensations, new words were wanted, and my imagination failed to supply them. I gazed, I thought, I admired, with a stupefaction mingled with a certain amount of fear. The unforeseen nature of this spectacle brought back the color to my cheeks. I was under a new course of treatment with the aid of astonishment, and my convalescence was promoted by this novel system of therapeutics. Besides, the dense and breezy air invigorated me, supplying more oxygen to my lungs. It will be easily conceived that, after an imprisonment of 47 days in a narrow gallery, it was the height of physical enjoyment to breathe a moist air impregnated with saline particles. I was delighted to leave my dark grotto. My uncle, already familiar with these wonders, had ceased to feel surprise. "You feel strong enough to walk a little way now?" he asked. "Yes, certainly, and nothing could be more delightful." "Well, take my arm, Axel, and let us follow the windings of the shore." I eagerly accepted, and we began to coast along this new sea. On the left, huge pyramids of rock, piled one upon another, produced a prodigious titanic effect. Down their sides flowed numberless waterfalls, which went on their way in brawling but pellucid streams. A few light vapors, leaping from rock to rock, denoted the place of hot springs, and streams flowed softly down to the common basin, gliding down the gentle slopes with a softer murmur. Amongst these streams I recognized our faithful travelling companion, the Hansbach, coming to lose its little volume quietly in the mighty sea, just as if it had done nothing else since the beginning of the world. "We shall see it no more," I said with a sigh. "What matters," replied the philosopher, "whether this or another serves to guide us?" I thought him rather ungrateful. But at that moment my attention was drawn to an unexpected sight. At a distance of 500 paces, at the turn of a high promontory, appeared a high, tufted, dense forest. It was composed of trees of moderate height, formed like umbrellas, with exact geometrical outlines. The currents of wind seemed to have had no effect upon their shape, and in the midst of the windy blasts they stood unmoved and firm, just like a clump of petrified cedars. I hastened forward. I could not give any name to these singular creations. Were they some of the 200,000 species of vegetables known hitherto? And did they claim a place of their own in the lacustrine flora? No. When we arrived under their shade, my surprise turned into admiration. There stood before me productions of earth, but of gigantic stature, which my uncle immediately named. "It is only a forest of mushrooms," said he. And he was right. Imagine the large development attained by these plants, which prefer a warm, moist climate. I knew that the Lycopodon giganteum attains, according to Bulliard, a circumference of 8 or 9 feet. But here were pale mushrooms, 30 to 40 feet high, and crowned with a cap of equal diameter. There they stood in thousands. No light could penetrate between their huge cones, and complete darkness reigned beneath those giants. They formed settlements of domes placed in close array like the round thatched roofs of a Central African city. Yet I wanted to penetrate farther underneath, though a chill fell upon me as soon as I came under those cellular vaults. For half an hour we wandered from side to side in the damp shades, and it was a comfortable and pleasant change to arrive once more upon the seashore. But the subterranean vegetation was not confined to these fungi. Farther on rose groups of tall trees of colorless foliage and easy to recognize. They were lowly shrubs of earth, here attaining gigantic size, lycopodiums 100 feet high, the huge sigillaria found in our coal mines, tree ferns as tall as our fir trees in northern latitudes, lepidodendra with cylindrical forked stems terminated by long leaves and bristling with rough hairs like those of the cactus. "Wonderful! Magnificent! Splendid!" cried my uncle. "Here is the entire flora of the second period of the world, the transition period. These humble garden plants with us were tall trees in the early ages. Look, Axel, and admire it all. Never had botanists such a feast as this." "You're right, my uncle. Providence seems to have preserved in this immense conservatory the antediluvian plants which the wisdom of philosophers has so sagaciously put together again." "It is a conservatory, Axel." "But is it not also a menagerie?" "Surely not a menagerie." "Yes, no doubt of it. Look at that dust under your feet. See the bones scattered on the ground." "So there are," I cried. "Bones of extinct animals." I had rushed upon these remains, formed of indestructible phosphates of lime, and without hesitation I named these monstrous bones, which lay scattered about like decayed trunks of trees. "Here is the lower jaw of a mastodon," I said. "These are the molar teeth of the Dinotherium. This femur must have belonged to the greatest of those beasts, the Megatherium. It certainly is a menagerie, for these remains were not brought here by a deluge. The animals to which they belonged roamed on the shores of this subterranean sea under the shade of those arborescent trees. Here are entire skeletons. And yet I cannot understand the appearance of these quadrupeds in a granite cavern." "Why?" "Because animal life existed upon the earth only in the secondary period, when a sediment of soil had been deposited by the rivers and taken the place of the incandescent rocks of the primitive period." "Well, Axel, there is a very simple answer to your objection that this soil is alluvial." "What? At such a depth below the surface of the earth?" "No doubt, and there is a geological explanation of the fact. At a certain period, the earth consisted only of an elastic crust, or bark, alternately acted on by forces from above or below, according to the laws of attraction and gravitation. Probably there were subsidences of the outer crust, when a portion of the sedimentary deposits was carried down sudden openings." "That may be," I replied, "but if there have been creatures now extinct in these underground regions, why may not some of those monsters be now roaming through these gloomy forests, or hidden behind the steep crags?" And as this unpleasant notion got hold of me, I surveyed with anxious scrutiny the open spaces before me. But no living creature appeared upon the barren strand. I felt rather tired, and went to sit down at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves came and beat themselves into spray. Thence my eye could sweep every part of the bay. Within its extremity a little harbour was formed between the pyramidal cliffs, where the still waters slept untouched by the boisterous winds. A brig and 2 or 3 schooners might have moored within it in safety. I almost fancied I should presently see some ship issue from it, full sail, and take to the open sea under the southern breeze. But this illusion lasted a very short time. We were the only living creatures in this subterranean world. When the wind lulled, a deeper silence than that of the deserts fell upon the arid naked rocks, and weighed upon the surface of the ocean. I then desired to pierce the distant haze, and to rend asunder the mysterious curtain that hung across the horizon. Anxious queries arose to my lips. Where did that sea terminate? Where did it lead to? Should we ever know anything about its opposite shores? My uncle made no doubt about it at all. I both desired and feared. After spending an hour in the contemplation of this marvelous spectacle, we returned to the shore to regain the grotto, and I fell asleep in the midst of the strangest thoughts. End of chapter 30. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 31. Preparations for a Voyage of Discovery. The next morning I awoke feeling perfectly well. I thought a bathe would do me good, and I went to plunge for a few minutes into the waters of this Mediterranean Sea, for assuredly it better deserved this name than any other sea. I came back to breakfast with a good appetite. Hans was a good caterer for our little household. He had water and fire at his disposal, so that he was able to vary our bill of fare now and then. For dessert he gave us a few cups of coffee, and never was coffee so delicious. "Now," said my uncle, "now is the time for high tide, and we must not lose the opportunity to study this phenomenon. "What? The tide?" I cried. "Can the influence of the sun and moon be felt down here?" "Why not? Are not all bodies subject throughout their mass to the power of universal attraction? This mass of water cannot escape the general law. And in spite of the heavy atmospheric pressure on the surface, you will see it rise like the Atlantic itself." At the same moment we reached the sand on the shore, and the waves were by slow degrees encroaching on the shore. "Here is the tide rising!" I cried. "Yes, Axel, and judging by these ridges of foam, you may observe that the sea will rise about 12 feet. "This is wonderful," I said. "No, it is quite natural." "You may say so, uncle, but to me it is most extraordinary, and I can hardly believe my eyes. Who would ever have imagined, under this terrestrial crust, an ocean with ebbing and flowing tides, with winds and storms?" "Well," replied my uncle, "is there any scientific reason against it?" "No, I see none as soon as the theory of central heat is given up." "So then, thus far," he answered, "the theory of Sir Humphrey Davy is confirmed." "Evidently it is, and now there is no reason why there should not be seas and continents in the interior of the earth." "No doubt," said my uncle, "and inhabited too." "To be sure," said I. "And why should not these waters yield to us fishes of unknown species?" "At any rate," he replied, "we have not seen any yet." "Well, let us make some lines and see if the bait will draw here as it does in sublunary regions." "We will try, Axel, for we must penetrate all secrets of these newly discovered regions." "But where are we, uncle? For I have not yet asked you that question, and your instruments must be able to furnish the answer." "Horizontally, 350 leagues from Iceland." "So much as that?" "I am sure of not being a mile out of my reckoning." "And does the compass still show southeast?" "Yes, with a westerly deviation of 19 degrees 45 minutes, just as above ground. As for its dip, a curious fact is coming to light which I have observed carefully, that the needle, instead of dipping towards the pole as in the northern hemisphere, on the contrary rises from it." "Would you then conclude," I said, "that the magnetic pole is somewhere between the surface of the globe and the point where we are?" "Exactly so. And it is likely enough that if we were to reach the spot beneath the polar regions, about that 71st degree where Sir James Ross has discovered the magnetic pole to be situated, we should see the needle point straight up. Therefore that mysterious centre of attraction is at no great depth." I remarked, "It is so, and here is a fact which science has scarcely suspected." "Science, my lad, has been built upon many errors, but they are errors which it was good to fall into, for they led to the truth." "What depth have we now reached?" "We are 35 leagues below the surface." "So," I said, examining the map, "the Highlands of Scotland are over our heads, and the Grampians are raising their rugged summits above us." "Yes," answered the professor, laughing. "It is rather a heavy weight to bear, but a solid arch spans over our heads. The great architect has built it of the best materials, and never could man have given it so wide a stretch. What are the finest arches of bridges and the arcades of cathedrals compared with this far-reaching vault, with a radius of 3 leagues, beneath which a wide and tempest-tossed ocean may flow at its ease?" "Oh, I am not afraid that it will fall down upon my head. But now what are your plans? Are you not thinking of returning to the surface now?" "Return? No, indeed. We will continue our journey, everything having gone on well so far." "But how are we to get down below this liquid surface?" "Oh, I am not going to dive head foremost. But if all oceans are properly speaking but lakes, since they are encompassed by land, of course this internal sea will be surrounded by a coast of granite, and on the opposite shores we shall find fresh passages opening. How long do you suppose this sea to be? 30 or 40 leagues, so that we have no time to lose, and we shall set sail tomorrow. I looked about for a ship. Set sail, shall we? But I should like to see my boat first. It will not be a boat at all, but a good, well-made raft. Why, I said, a raft would be just as hard to make as a boat, and I don't see— I know you don't see, but you might hear if you would listen. Don't you hear the hammer at work? Hans is already busy at it. What, has he already felled the trees? Oh, the trees were already down. Come, and you will see for yourself. After half an hour's walking, on the other side of the promontory which formed the little natural harbour, I perceived Hans at work. In a few more steps I was at his side. To my great surprise, a half-finished raft was already lying on the sand, made of a peculiar kind of wood, and a great number of planks, straight and bent, and of frames, were covering the ground, enough almost for a little fleet. "Uncle, what wood is this?" I cried. "It is fir, pine, or birch, and other northern coniferæ, mineralized by the action of the sea. It is called surturbrand, a variety of brown coal or lignite, found chiefly in Iceland." "But surely, then, like other fossil wood, it must be as hard as stone and cannot float." "Sometimes that may happen. Some of these woods become true anthracites, but others, such as this, have only gone through the first stage of fossil transformation. Just look," added my uncle, throwing into the sea one of those precious waifs. The bit of wood, after disappearing, returned to the surface, and oscillated to and fro with the waves. "Are you convinced?" said my uncle. "I am quite convinced, although it is incredible." By next evening, thanks to the industry and skill of our guide, the raft was made. It was 10 feet by 5, the planks of surturbrand, braced strongly together with cords, presented an even surface, and when launched, this improvised vessel floated easily upon the waves of the Lidenbrock Sea. End of chapter 31. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 32. Wonders of the Deep. On the 13th of August we awoke early. We were now to begin to adopt a mode of travelling both more expeditious and less fatiguing than hitherto. A mast was made of 2 poles spliced together, a yard was made of a third, a blanket borrowed from our coverings made a tolerable sail. There was no want of cordage for the rigging, and everything was well and firmly made. The provisions, the baggage, the instruments, the guns, and a good quantity of fresh water from the rocks around, all found their proper places on board, and at 6 the professor gave the signal to embark. Hans had fitted up a rudder to steer his vessel. He took the tiller and unmoored. The sail was set, and we were soon afloat. At the moment of leaving the harbour, my uncle, who was tenaciously fond of naming his new discoveries, wanted to give it a name, and proposed mine amongst others. "But I have a better to propose," I said. "Grauben. Let it be called Port Grauben. It will look very well upon the map." "Port Grauben, let it be, then." And so the cherished remembrance of my Verlin days became associated with our adventurous expedition. The wind was from the northwest. We went with it at a high rate of speed. The dense atmosphere acted with great force, and impelled us swiftly on. In an hour my uncle had been able to estimate our progress. At this rate, he said, we shall make 30 leagues in 24 hours, and we shall soon come in sight of the opposite shore. I made no answer, but went and sat forward. The northern shore was already beginning to dip under the horizon. The eastern and western strands spread wide as if to bid us farewell. Before our eyes lay far and wide a vast sea. Shadows of great clouds swept heavily over its silver-gray surface. The glistening bluish rays of electric light, here and there reflected by the dancing drops of spray, shot out little sheaves of light from the track we left in our rear. Soon we entirely lost sight of land. No object was left for the eye to judge by, and but for the frothy track of the raft, I might have thought we were standing still. About 12, immense shoals of seaweeds came in sight. I was aware of the great powers of vegetation that characterize these plants, which grow at a depth of 12,000 feet, reproduce themselves under a pressure of 400 atmospheres, and sometimes form barriers strong enough to impede the course of a ship. But never, I think, were such seaweeds as those which we saw floating in immense waving lines upon the sea of Lidenbrock. Our raft skirted the whole length of the Fuci, 3,000 or 4,000 feet long, undulating like vast serpents beyond the reach of sight. I found some amusement in tracing these endless waves, always thinking I should come to the end of them, and for hours my patience was vying with my surprise. What natural force could have produced such plants, and what must have been the appearance of the earth in the first ages of its formation when, under the action of heat and moisture, the vegetable kingdom alone was developing on its surface? Evening came, and as on the previous day, I perceived no change in the luminous condition of the air. It was a constant condition, the permanency of which might be relied upon. After supper I laid myself down at the foot of the mast, and fell asleep in the midst of fantastic reveries. Hans, keeping fast by the helm, let the raft run on, which, after all, needed no steering, the wind blowing directly aft. Since our departure from Port Gräuben, Professor Lidenbrock had entrusted the log to my care. I was to register every observation, make entries of interesting phenomena, the direction of the wind, the rate of sailing, the way we made, in a word, every particular of our singular voyage. I shall therefore reproduce here these daily notes, written, so to speak, as the course of events directed, in order to furnish an exact narrative of our passage. Friday, August 14th. Wind steady, northwest. The raft makes rapid way in a direct line. Coast 30 leagues to leeward. Nothing in sight before us. Intensity of light the same. Weather fine, that is to say that the clouds are flying high, are light, and bathed in a white atmosphere resembling silver in a state of fusion. Thermometer 89 degrees Fahrenheit. At noon Hans prepared a hook at the end of a line. He baited it with a small piece of meat and flung it into the sea. For 2 hours nothing was caught. Are these waters, then, bare of inhabitants? No, there's a pull at the line. Hans draws it in and brings out a struggling fish. "A sturgeon!" I cried. "A small sturgeon!" The professor eyes the creature attentively, and his opinion differs from mine. The head of this fish was flat, but rounded in front, and the anterior part of its body was plated with bony, angular scales. It had no teeth, its pectoral fins were large, and of tail there was none. The animal belonged to the same order as the sturgeon, but differed from that fish in many essential particulars. After a short examination, my uncle pronounced his opinion. "This fish belongs to an extinct family, of which only fossil traces are found in the Devonian formations." "What?" I cried. "Have we taken alive an inhabitant of the seas of primitive ages?" "Yes, and you will observe that these fossil fishes have no identity with any living species. To have in one's possession a living specimen is a happy event for a naturalist." But to what family does it belong? It is of the order of ganoids, of the family of the Cephalaspidae, and a species of Pterichthys. But this one displays a peculiarity confined to all fishes that inhabit subterranean waters. It is blind, and not only blind, but actually has no eyes at all. I looked. Nothing could be more certain. But supposing it might be a solitary case, we baited afresh and threw out our line. Surely this ocean is well peopled with fish, for in another couple of hours we took a large quantity of Pterichthides, as well as of others belonging to the extinct family of the dipterides, but of which my uncle could not tell the species. None had organs of sight. This unhoped-for catch recruited our stock of provisions. Thus it is evident that this sea contains none but species known to us in their fossil state, in which fishes as well as reptiles are the less perfectly and completely organized the farther back their date of creation. Perhaps we may yet meet with some of those saurians which science has reconstructed out of a bit of bone or cartilage. I took up the telescope and scanned the whole horizon, and found it everywhere a desert sea. We are far away removed from the shores. I gaze upward in the air. Why should not some of the strange birds, restored by the immortal Cuvier, again flap their sail-broad vans in this dense and heavy atmosphere? There are sufficient fish for their support. I survey the whole space that stretches overhead. It is as desert as the shore was. Still, my imagination carried me away amongst the wonderful speculations of paleontology. Though awake, I fell into a dream. I thought I could see floating on the surface of the waters enormous chelonia, pre-Adamite tortoises, resembling floating islands. Over the dimly lighted strand there trod the huge mammals of the first ages of the world, the leptotherium, or slender beast, found in the caverns of Brazil, the Maricotherium, or ruminating beast, found in the drift of ice-clad Siberia. Farther on, the Pachydermatous Lophiodon, or crested-toothed, a gigantic tapir, hides behind the rocks to dispute its prey with the Anoplotherium, or unarmed beast, a strange creature which seemed a compound of horse, rhinoceros, camel, and hippopotamus. The colossal Mastodon, or nipple-toothed, twists and untwists his trunk, and brays and pounds with his huge tusks the fragments of rock that cover the shore, whilst the Megatherium, or huge beast, buttressed upon his enormous hinder paws, grubs in the soil, awaking the sonorous echoes of the granite rocks with his tremendous roarings. Higher up, the Protopithica, the first monkey that appeared on the globe, is climbing up the steep ascents. Higher yet, the pterodactyl, or wing-fingered, darts in irregular zigzags to and fro in the heavy air. In the uppermost regions of the air, immense birds, more powerful than the cassowary, and larger than the ostrich, spread their vast breadth of wings, and strike with their heads the granite vault that bounds the sky. All this fossil world rises to life again in my vivid imagination. I return to the scriptural periods or ages of the world, conventionally called days, long before the appearance of man, when the unfinished world was as yet unfitted for his support. Then my dream backed even farther still, into the ages before the creation of living beings. The mammals disappear, then the birds vanish, then the reptiles of the secondary period, and finally the fish, the crustaceans, mollusks, and articulated beings. Then the zoophytes of the transition period also return to nothing. I am the only living thing in the world. All life is concentrated in my beating heart alone. There are no more seasons. Climates are no more. The heat of the globe continually increases and neutralizes that of the sun. Vegetation becomes accelerated. I glide like a shade amongst arborescent ferns, treading with unsteady feet the colored marls and the particolored clays. I lean for support against the trunks of immense conifers. I lie in the shade of sphenophylla, or wedge-leaved, astrophylla, or star-leaved, and lycopods, 100 feet high. Ages seem no more than days. I am passed, against my will, in retrograde order, through the long series of terrestrial changes. Plants disappear. Granite rocks soften. Intense heat converts solid bodies into thick fluids. The waters again cover the face of the earth. They boil. They rise in whirling eddies of steam. White and ghastly mists wrap around the shifting forms of the earth, which by imperceptible degrees dissolves into a gaseous mass, glowing fiery red and white, as large and as shining as the sun. And I myself am floating with wild caprice in the midst of this nebulous mass of 1,400,000 times the volume of the earth, into which it will one day be condensed and carried forward amongst the planetary bodies. My body is no longer firm and terrestrial. It is resolved into its constituent atoms, subtilized, volatilized. Sublimed into imponderable vapor, I mingle and am lost in the endless floods of those vast globular volumes of vaporous mists, which roll upon their flaming orbits through infinite space. But is it not a dream? Whither is it carrying me? My feverish hand has vainly attempted to describe upon paper its strange and wonderful details. I have forgotten everything that surrounds me. The professor, the guide, the raft, are all gone out of my ken. An illusion has laid hold upon me. "What is the matter?" my uncle breaks in. My staring eyes are fixed vacantly upon him. "Take care, Axel, or you will fall overboard." At that moment I felt the sinewy hand of Hans seizing me vigorously. But for him, carried away by my dream, I should have thrown myself into the sea. "Is he mad?" cried the professor. "What is it all about?" at last I cried, returning to myself. "Do you feel ill?" my uncle asked. "No, but I have had a strange hallucination. It is over now. Is all going on right?" "Yes, it is a fair wind and a fine sea. We are sailing rapidly along, and if I am not out in my reckoning, we shall soon land." At these words I rose and gazed round upon the horizon, still everywhere bounded by clouds alone. End of chapter 32.
A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 33. A Battle of Monsters. Saturday, August 15th. The sea unbroken all round. No land in sight. The horizon seems extremely distant. My head is still stupefied with the vivid reality of my dream. My uncle has had no dreams, but he is out of temper. He examines the horizon all round with his glass, and folds his arms with the air of an injured man. I remark that Professor Liedenbrock has a tendency to relapse into an impatient mood, and I make note of it in my log. All my danger and sufferings were needed to strike a spark of human feeling out of him. But now that I am well, his nature has resumed its sway. And yet, what cause was there for anger? Is not the voyage prospering as favorably as possible under the circumstances? Is not the raft spinning along with marvelous speed? "You seem anxious, my uncle," I said, seeing him continually with his glass to his eye. "Anxious? No, not at all." "Impatient, then?" "One might be, with less reason than now." "Yet we are going very fast." "What does that signify? I am not complaining that the rate is slow, but that the sea is so wide." I then remembered that the professor, before starting, had estimated the length of this underground sea at 30 leagues. Now we had made 3 times the distance, Yet still the southern coast was not in sight. "We're not descending, as we ought to be," the professor declares. "We are losing time, and the fact is, I have not come all this way to take a little sail upon a pond on a raft." He called this sea a pond, and our long voyage taking a little sail. "But," I remarked, "since we have followed the road that Saknussemm has shown us—" "That is just the question. Have we followed that road? Did Saknussemm meet with the sheet of water? Did he cross it? Has not the stream that we followed led us altogether astray? At any rate, we cannot feel sorry to have come so far. The prospect is magnificent, but I don't care for prospects. I came with an object, and I mean to attain it. Therefore, don't talk to me about views and prospects." I take this as my answer, and I leave the professor to bite his lips with impatience. At 6 in the evening, Hans asks for his wages, and the 3 rix-dollars are counted out to him. Sunday, August 16th. Nothing new, weather unchanged. The wind freshens. On awaking, my first thought was to observe the intensity of the light. I was possessed with an apprehension lest the electric light should grow dim or fail altogether. But there seemed no reason to fear. The shadow of the raft was clearly outlined upon the surface of the waves. Truly this sea is of infinite width. It must be as wide as the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. And why not? My uncle took soundings several times. He tied the heaviest of our pickaxes to long rope, which he let down 200 fathoms. No bottom yet, and we had some difficulty in hauling up our plummet. But when the pick was shipped again, Hans pointed out on its surface deep prints, as if it had been violently compressed between 2 hard bodies. I looked at the hunter. "Tender," he said. I should not understand him, and turned to my uncle, who was entirely absorbed in his calculations. I had rather not disturb him while he is quiet. I returned to the Icelander. He, by snapping motion of his jaws, conveys his idea to me. "Teeth!" I cried, considering the iron bar with more attention. Yes, indeed, those are the marks of teeth imprinted upon the metal. The jaws which they arm must be possessed of amazing strength. Is there some monster beneath us belonging to the extinct races, more voracious than the shark, more fearful in vastness than the whales? I could not take my eyes off this indented iron bar. Surely will my last night's dream be realized. These thoughts agitated me all day, and my imagination scarcely calmed down after several hours' sleep. Monday, August 17th. I am trying to recall the peculiar instincts of the monsters of the pre-Adamite world, who, coming next in succession after the mollusks, the crustaceans, and les fiches, preceded the animals of mammalian race upon the earth. The world then belonged to reptiles. These monsters held the mastery of the seas of the secondary period. They possessed a perfect organization, gigantic proportions, prodigious strength. The saurians of our day, the alligators and crocodiles, are but feeble reproductions of their forefathers of primitive ages. I shudder as I recall these monsters to my remembrance. No human eye has ever beheld them living. They burdened this earth 1,000 ages before man appeared, but their fossil remains, found in the argillaceous limestone, called by the English the lias, have enabled their colossal structure to be perfectly built up again and anatomically ascertained. I saw at the Hamburg Museum the skeleton of one of these creatures, 30 feet in length. Am I then fated, I, a denizen of the earth, to be placed face to face with these representatives of a long extinct family? No, surely it cannot be. Yet the deep marks of conical teeth upon the iron pick are certainly those of a crocodile. My eyes are fearfully bent upon the sea. I dread to see one of these monsters darting forth from its submarine caves. I suppose Professor Liedenbrock was of my opinion too, and even shared my fears, for after having examined the pig, his eyes traversed the ocean from side to side. What a very bad notion that was of his, I thought to myself, to take soundings just here. He had disturbed some monstrous beast in its remote den, and if we were not attacked on our voyage, I look at our guns and see that they are all right. My uncle notices it, and looks on approvingly. Already, wildly disturbed regions of the surface of the water indicate some commotion below. The danger is approaching. We must be on the lookout. Tuesday, August 18th. Evening came, or rather the time when sleep weighs down the weary eyelids, for there is no night here, and the ceaseless light wearies the eyes with its persistency, just as if we were sailing under the Arctic sun. Hans was at the helm. During his watch, I slept. 2 hours afterwards, a terrible shock awoke me. The raft was heaved up on a watery mountain and pitched down again at a distance of 20 fathoms. "What is the matter?" shouted my uncle. "Have we struck land?" Hans pointed with his finger at a dark mass 600 yards away, rising and falling alternately with heavy plunges. I looked and cried, "It's an enormous porpoise!" "Yes," replied my uncle, "and there is a sea lizard of vast size." "And farther on a monstrous crocodile. Look at its vast jaws and its rows of teeth. It is diving down." "There's a whale!" cried the professor. "I can see its great fins. See how he is throwing out air and water through his blowers." And in fact 2 liquid columns were rising to a considerable height above the sea. We stood amazed, thunderstruck, at the presence of such a herd of marine monsters. They were of supernatural dimensions. The smallest of them would have crunched our raft, crew and all, at one snap of its huge jaws. Hans went to tack to get away from the dangerous neighborhood, but he sees on the other hand enemies not less terrible, a tortoise 40 feet long, and a serpent of 30, lifting its fearful head and gleaming eyes above the flood. Flight was out of the question now. The reptiles rose. They wheeled around our little raft with a rapidity greater than that of express trains. They described around us gradually narrowing circles. I took up my rifle. But what could a ball do against the scaly armor with which enormous beasts were clad? We stood dumb with fear. They approached us close. On one side the crocodile, on the other the serpent. The remainder of the sea monsters have disappeared. I prepare to fire. Hans stops me by a gesture. The 2 monsters pass within 150 yards of the raft, and hurl themselves upon one another with a fury which prevents them from seeing us. At 300 yards from us the battle was fought. We could distinctly observe the 2 monsters engaged in a deadly conflict, but it now seems to me as if the other animals were taking part in the fray. The porpoise, the whale, the lizard, the tortoise. Every moment I seem to see one or the other of them. I point to the Icelander. He shakes his head negatively. "Tva," he says. "What 2? Does he mean that there are only 2 animals?" "He is right," said my uncle, whose glass never left his eye. "Surely you must be mistaken," I cried. "No, the first of those monsters has a porpoise's snout, a lizard's head, a crocodile's teeth, and hence our mistake. It is the ichthyosaurus, the fish lizard, the most terrible of the ancient monsters of the deep." "And the other?" "The other is a plesiosaurus, almost lizard, a serpent armored with a carapace and the paddles of a turtle. He is the dreadful enemy of the other." Hans had spoken truly. 2 monsters only were creating all this commotion, and before my eyes are 2 reptiles of the primitive world. I can distinguish the eye of the ichthyosaurus, glowing like a red-hot coal and as large as a man's head. Nature has endowed it with an optical apparatus of extreme power and capable of resisting the pressure of the great volume of water in the depths of it inhabits. It is appropriately called the saurian whale, for it has both the swiftness and the rapid movements of this monster of our own day. This one is not less than 100 feet long, and I can judge of its size when it sweeps over the waters the vertical coils of its tail. Its jaw is enormous, and according to naturalists, it is armed with no less than 182 teeth. The plesiosaurus, a serpent with a cylindrical body and a short tail, has 4 flappers or paddles to act like oars. Its body is entirely covered with a thick armor of scales, and its neck, as flexible as a swan's, rises 30 feet above the waves. Those huge creatures attacked each other with the greatest animosity. They heaved around them liquid mountains, which rolled even to our raft and rocked it perilously. 20 times we were near capsizing. Hissings of prodigious force are heard. The 2 beasts are fast locked together. I cannot distinguish the one from the other. The probable rage of the conqueror inspires us with intense fear. A Journey to the Interior of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 34. The Great Geyser. Wednesday, August 19th. Fortunately, the wind blows violently, and has enabled us to flee from the scene of the late terrible struggle. Hans keeps at his post at the helm. My uncle, whom the absorbing incidents of the combat had drawn away from his contemplations, began again to look impatiently around him. The voyage resumes its uniform tenor, which I don't care to break with a repetition of such events as yesterday's. Thursday, August 20th. Wind north to northeast, unsteady and fitful. Temperature high. Rate 3½ leagues an hour. About noon a distant noise is heard. I note the fact without being able to explain it. It is a continuous roar. "In the distance," says the professor, "there's a rock or inlet, against which the sea is breaking." Hans climbs up the mast, but sees no breakers. The ocean is smooth and unbroken to its farthest limit. 3 hours pass. The roarings seem to proceed from a very distant waterfall. I remark upon this to my uncle, who replies doubtfully, "Yes, I am convinced that I am right." Are we, then, speeding forward to some cataract which will cast us down an abyss? This method of getting on may please the professor, because it is vertical, but for my part, I prefer the more ordinary modes of horizontal progression. At any rate, some leagues to the windward there must be some noisy phenomenon, for now the roarings are heard with increasing loudness. Do they proceed from the sky or the ocean? I look up to the atmospheric vapors, and try to fathom their depths. The sky is calm and motionless. The clouds have reached the utmost limit of their lofty vault, and there lie bathed in the bright glare of the electric light. It is not there that we must seek for the cause of the phenomenon. Then I examine the horizon, which is unbroken and clear of all mist. There is no change in its aspect. But if the noise arises from a fall, a cataract, if all this ocean flows away headlong into the lower basin yet, if the deafening roar is produced by a mass of falling water, the current must needs accelerate, and its increasing speed will give me the measure of the peril that threatens us. I consult the current. There is none. I throw an empty bottle into the sea. It lies still. About 4, Hans rises, lays hold of the mast, climbs to its top. Thence his eye sweeps a large area of sea, and it is fixed upon a point. His countenance exhibits no surprise, but his eye is immovably steady. He sees something, says my uncle. I believe he does. Hans comes down, then stretches his arm to the south, saying, "Der near." "Down there," repeated my uncle. Then, seizing his glass, he gazes attentively for a minute, which seems to me an age. "Yes, yes," he cried, "I see a vast inverted cone rising from the surface. Is it another sea beast?" "Perhaps it is." "Then let us steer farther westward, for we know something of the danger of coming across monsters of that sort." "Let us go straight on," replied my uncle. I appealed to Hans. He maintained his course inflexibly. Yet, if at our present distance from the animal, a distance of 12 leagues at the least, the column of water driven through its blowers may be distinctly seen, it must needs be of vast size. The commonest of prudence would counsel immediate flight, but we did not come so far to be prudent. Imprudently, therefore, we pursue our way. The nearer we approach, the higher mounts the jet of water. What monster can possibly fill itself with such a quantity of water and spurt it up so continuously? At 8 in the evening, we are not 2 leagues distant from it. Its body, dusky, enormous, hillocky, lies spread upon the sea like an islet. Is it illusion or fear? Its length seems to me a couple of 1,000 yards. What can be this cetacean, which neither Cuvier nor Blumenbach knew anything about? It lies motionless, as if asleep. The sea seems unable to move it in the least. It is the waves that undulate upon its sides. The column of water thrown up to a height of 500 feet falls in rain with a deafening uproar. And here are we scudding like lunatics before the wind, to get near to a monster that 100 whales a day would not satisfy. Terror seizes upon me. I refuse to go further. I will cut the halyards if necessary. I am in open mutiny against the professor, who vouchsafes no answer. Suddenly, Hans rises, and pointing with his finger at the menacing object, he says, "Holm." "An island!" cries my uncle. "That's not an island," I cried skeptically. "It's nothing else," shouted the professor with a loud laugh. "But the column of water." "Geyser," said Hans. "No doubt it's a geyser, like those in Iceland." At first I protest against being so wildly mistaken as to have taken the island for a marine monster, but the evidence is against me, and I have to confess my error. It is nothing worse than a natural phenomenon. As we approach nearer, the dimensions of the liquid column become magnificent. The islet resembles, with a most deceiving likeness, an enormous cetacean, whose head dominates the waves at a height of 20 yards. The geyser, a word meaning fury, rises majestically from its extremity. Deep and heavy explosions are heard from time to time when the enormous jet, possessed with more furious violence, shakes its plumy crest and springs with a bound till it reaches the lowest stratum of the clouds. It stands alone. No steam vents, no hot springs surround it, and all the volcanic power of the region is concentrated here. Sparks of electric fire mingle with the dazzling sheaf of lighted fluid, every drop of which refracts the prismatic colors. "Let us land," said the professor. "But we must carefully avoid this waterspout, which would sink our raft in a moment." Hans, steering with his usual skill, brought us to the other extremity of the islet. I leaped up past the rock my uncle lightly followed, while our hunter remained at his post, like a man too wise ever to be astonished. We walk upon granite mingled with silicious tufa. The soil shivers and shakes under our feet, like the sides of an overheated boiler filled with steam struggling to get loose. We come in sight of a small central basin, out of which the geyser springs. I plunge a register thermometer into the boiling water. It marks an intense heat of 325 degrees, which is far above the boiling point. Therefore this water issues from an ardent furnace, which is not all in harmony with the Professor Liedenbrock's theories. I cannot help making the remark. "Well," he replied, "how does that make against my doctrine?" "Oh, nothing at all," I said, seeing that I was going in the opposition to an immovable obstinacy. "Still, I am constrained to confess that hitherto we have been wonderfully favored, and that for some reason unknown to myself we have accomplished our journey under singularly favorable conditions of temperature. But it seems manifest to me that some day we shall reach a region where the central heat attains its highest limits and goes beyond a point that can be registered by our thermometers." "That is what we shall see," so the professor, who, having named the volcanic islet after his nephew, gives the signal to embark again. For some minutes I am still contemplating the geyser. I notice that it throws up a column of water with variable force, sometimes sending it to a great height, then again to a lower, which I attribute to the variable pressure of the steam accumulated in its reservoir. At last we leave the island, rounding away past the low rocks on its southern shore. Hans has taken advantage of the halt to retrofit his rudder. But before going any further, I make a few observations to calculate the distance we have gone over and note them in my journal. We have crossed 270 leagues of sea since leaving Port Gräuben, and we are 620 leagues from Iceland under England. End of chapter 34.